Hi, everyone. It's Shawn with Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. Thank you for joining me again. So, this was supposed to be part two of a two-part series, but as often happens when you're tracing the family tree of a literal god, as I'm sure we all do in our spare time, things got out of hand. We're probably looking at four, maybe even five episodes by the time this journey is through, so consider this episode still part two, but not the end, just the next chapter in the series, The Legacy of the Allfather. Last time, we discussed Odin's 10 mythical sons as told by Snorri Sturluson in his Prose Edda in the sections the Prologue, Gylfaginning, and Skadskaparmal, briefly going into some contradictions with Freyr and Tyr, whose other fathers are discussed elsewhere in the Eddas. Though all 10 sons played a part in Ragnarok, we primarily focused on the six sons mentioned in Gylfaginning, as that section gives us what I consider to be the best description of the Norse universe that we have. It starts off with the creation myth, gives us descriptions of the universe and the gods themselves, and ends with the aforementioned events surrounding Ragnarok. Those six sons in that story were Thor, Balder, Hod, Vali, Vidar, and Hermod. The other four would be Freyr from the prologue, and then Tyr, Hemdall, and Bragi from Skadskaparmal. In briefly discussing their arcs and the part they played in the Twilight of the Gods, I also needed to discuss the six children of Loki, as they all had parts to play as well, mostly in direct conflict with Odin's sons and the rest of the Aesir. Now, the part that I wanted to recap from that episode in the lead up to this one was Odin's motivation. We discussed Odin's lust for knowledge and his desire for himself to grow in this capacity by learning and knowing everything. In doing so, he taps into what we often see in movies and shows, which would be considered quite taboo, waking the dead. He wakes up a dead witch who is clearly unhappy with being disturbed from her eternal rest in an effort to learn her cosmic knowledge. This is from the poem Voluspa in the Poetic Edda. And he flies too close to the sun on this quest for knowledge, because she tells him of his own death and the death of most of his kin at Ragnarok. The price you pay for wanting to know everything, understanding that even he as a god is not all powerful, and he is forced to face his mortality as we humans do. Odin's actions at that point do show that he was trying to stop this fate, as he and the Aesir knew that Loki's children, Hel, Jormungandr, and Fenrir, would cause Ragnarok, and that this would begin with the death of his son Balder. So, of course, he wanted to stop them. We also discussed how his actions in trying to stop them literally caused the events he was trying to prevent. However, I like to think that in some part, Odin knew he was destined to fail and would have to face his mortality and the near destruction of the universe that he took part in creating. However, the witch did tell him about the rebirth afterwards, in a world where Vidar, Vali, and Thor's sons survive and live on, and also Balder and Hod come back from the dead from Hel, the underworld ruled by Loki's daughter of the same name. So he knew that some of his sons and descendants would still be around. I also discussed his role in potentially trying to set the stage for his descendants to thrive, both gods and men, assuming that his goal of preventing his own death would fail. Why not plant the seeds of greatness for them? So in this episode, we return to Midgard, which, if it isn't obvious, is Earth. And if you remember from the last time, also happens to be Odin's wife/daughter and the mother of Thor. Myth gets very weird. I mentioned earlier that this series is expanding, and that's because Odin's so-called historical bloodlines are incredibly vast. So rather than diving into the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms just yet, today's episode will focus solely on the birth of the historical kingdoms of Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. We already did this in detail in the first episode of the podcast, The Divine Ancestry of Harald Fairhair with Norway. In hindsight, after an episode discussing Odin's mythical sons, I could have just made that episode into part of this series on the legacy of Odin, but oh well, I messed up. Let's all take my poor planning for what it is and just move past it. In part three, I'll cover the Anglo-Saxon kings of England, who are also supposedly descendant from Odin, or Woden as he is called. I'll use the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Bishop Asser's Book of King Alfred of Wessex. Then in part four, we'll discuss the legendary kings of Denmark, the Skjoldungs, a dynastic line that parallels the Yinglings. The mythic kings of Sweden and Norway we discussed in part one, as I mentioned, but in part four, I'm going to use the Gesta Danorum for that episode. but also the Epic of Beowulf. Finally, in part 5, we tie it all together with Snorri Sturluson's prologue, where he not only connects many of the royal lines we have and will discuss to Odin, but also describes Odin's own ancestry, tracing it in a way that aligns with the pseudo-historical Christian worldview, where Odin is not the grandson of the first god Buri, but just a man. Not unlike his role in Ynglinga Saga, because as a Christian, which Snorri was, you obviously cannot have Odin elevated to the status of a god because that is blasphemous, apparently. In the first episode of this podcast, as mentioned, we did go into Odin's role in planting the seeds of both the family of the Ynglinks and the Volsungs, the latter of which Odin is the blood ancestor of. Also, playing Kingmaker on Midgard isn't something he does only with his descendants. In the Poetic Edda poem Grímnismál, there was a king Hrathung on Midgard. Hrathung had two sons, Agnar and Gareth. The sons went rowing one day and due to high winds got lost at sea. So they were taken in by a farmer and his wife for the winter. When spring came, the man gave them a boat to return to their father's kingdom. However, before doing so, the man whispered a few words into Gareth's ear. You find out here that the farmer and his wife were actually the god Odin and his wife, the goddess Frigg. Odin's whispers to Gareth were to tell him to arrange for his brother Agnar to get lost at sea again, banishing him for good by literally just getting off the boat first when they arrive back to their father's kingdom, then pushing the boat back out to sea with his brother still on it. And just like Palpatine returning, this somehow worked. And Agnar was successfully exiled by his brother and lived his life with trolls in a cave from that point on. Imagine rowing all day at sea, arriving at your destination, then being thwarted by your brother who pushed the boat back out from the dock and then being lost forever. Like he was probably only pushed about 10 feet max, though this is mythology and this was the wishes of Odin the Allfather, so it's fine. Anyway, Gareth returned to his father's kingdom only to find that his father had died. So Gareth was made king. I guess this kingdom practices primogeniture succession. King Gareth, son of Hrathung, named his first son after his brother Agnar, who he previously had banished. Now back in Asgard, Odin and Frigg were having a chat when Gareth's son Agnar turned 10 years old. Frigg told Odin that his old foster son had grown into a terrible king, greedy, cruel, and unwilling to feed his own people. Odin, of course, brushed this off as typical socialist whining, insisting that Gareth's free market policies were working just fine. However, he agreed to go back down to Midgard to get a better look of the character of the king he previously had fostered. Frigg then sent her servant Fulla to Midgard before Odin to warn King Hrathung of a, quote, man's arrival, who should not be trusted, and that he would know who it is because the king's dogs would not bark at him. Now, if you've ever had a dog, you know that them not barking at strangers is a considerable red flag, especially if you have a Labradoodle who thinks Netflix binge time is the perfect moment to scream bark right into your ear if it sees a leaf outside. If the dogs don't bark at strangers, there may be some treachery afoot, or in this case, a god well-versed in magic who owns wolves of his own, who are not hugely dissimilar to dogs, those wolves of Odin being Gary and Freki in the myths. When Odin arrived at the king's hall, and the dogs did not go berserk at this stranger, Gareth, taking Fulla's advice on behalf of Frigg, had Odin imprisoned and tortured. Gareth's son Agnar took pity on Odin and gave him a drink in his cell. Odin then knew his wife was right about the character of his former foster son Gareth and had him killed. The 10-year-old Agnar then inherited the throne from his father. And then Odin went back to Asgard to his wife to say, "Fine, you were right." The poem plays a larger role in the myths. However, for this episode, I just wanted to highlight that Odin realizing his mistake and fixing that mistake to put a child who would be the better king on a throne in Midgard shows that Odin does somewhat care about his creation and humanity, even if they are not his direct descendants, which serves as a segue into today's content. Before that, however, I did have another note, and this involves the god Bragi. Earlier, I mentioned that all of Odin's 10 sons in the myths had a part to play in the events surrounding Ragnarok. With Bragi, however, not so much. But since this is my podcast, I'm saying that he did, though I will admit through a very fuzzy lens. For Bragi, One, in the poem Lokasenna, Bragi is the first god to be singled out by Loki when he drunkenly insulted the rest of the gods in Aegir's Hall, one of the final events right before Ragnarok. And this results in Loki being chased out of the hall, captured, chained up, and tortured up until Ragnarok. Bragi also plays a part in the poem Eriksmál that I find interesting. Bragi, the poet god, and Per Snorri, the bearded god, has a conversation with Odin discussing why Valhalla seems to be preparing for a celebration. This is not unlike the dialogue between Odin and another dead witch in the poem Baldur's Drummer that I discussed last week. When Odin inquires why Hel, the realm in Niflheim that's ruled by Loki's daughter Hel, seemed to be preparing for a banquet, only to find out that it was because his son Baldur was going there upon his death. Turns out in Eriksmál, Odin was preparing for the arrival of the Midgardian king Erik Bloodaxe. Through the dialogue, Bragi asks Odin a question implying that Odin orchestrated his death on the battlefield so that he could enter Valhalla and then fight on Odin's side at Ragnarok. So you hear through Bragi a bit about Odin's motivations. He chooses who wins and loses battles as he needs the best warriors to fight on his side. As a result, he often lets the weaker king/army win. This is something that Loki calls Odin out for directly in Lokasenna. He's effectively changing the fates of men on Midgard, men who should be great kings with great armies, but orchestrating their death so they join him at the fight at Ragnarok. For instance, in the Saga of the Volsungs, the lover of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer of the House of Volsung was Brynhild the Valkyrie. However, as a Valkyrie, she worked for Odin. She had a falling out with Odin because she selected the wrong king against Odin's wishes on the battlefield to win that battle. So again, a very weak case to be made for Bragi playing a part in Ragnarok, him being the first that Loki insults, and his conversation with Odin in preparation for Ragnarok. But if Bragi is Odin's son, you would have to expect in some capacity he is preparing for it and well aware of it. Maybe I'm just biased because I admire Bragi as being the bearded god. And as a 38-year-old male, I still cannot personally grow a beard. One last note about Eriksmál that I think is pretty cool and connects the stories we have discussed is that Sigmund and his son Sinfjöldli, also from the house of Volsung, are present in Valhalla. Also, Erik Bloodaxe is the son of the first king of Norway, Harald Fairhair, that we discussed in depth in episode 1. And Erik served as its king for a time as well, starting in 930 CE. So Sigmund would be Erik's direct ancestor by 8 generations, and Odin would also be a direct ancestor by 12 if you use the line through the Volsungs that I discussed in episode 1. At the end of the poem, Sigmund then greets Erik, his descendant, on his arrival directly. This is fitting because per the Volsung saga, Odin also orchestrated the death of Sigmund, in that case killing him directly with his spear Gungnir. Anyway, let's get started piggybacking off of my note on Harald to dive slightly deeper into the descendants of the Allfather that led to historical kingdoms here on Midgard, and truly capture Odin's legacy not only in the myths, but potentially in this world. Also, since I just discussed the historical figure of Erik Bloodaxe, son of Harald Fairhair, and we know his direct line from Odin through the Volsungs, we will recap that line leading to Norway briefly. I'll list that line from Odin down to Harald, who again created the Kingdom of Norway, which still exists today with King Harald V. In the show The Crown, Prince Charles, played by Detective Dominic West, describes Harald V as having a head that looks like an egg since he is bald, though I'm sure he can at least grow a beard, unlike your host. So anyway, we have Odin, his son Siggy, his son Reyrir, his son Volsung, his son Sigmund, his son Sigurd the Dragon Slayer, his daughter with Brynhild the Valkyrie, Aslaug, her son with Ragnar Lodbrok, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, his daughter Aslaug, who I'm just going to call Aslaug II moving forward, her son Sigurd the Heart, his daughter Ragnhild, and her son Harald Fairhair, first king of Norway, also the father of Erik Bloodaxe, who, as I mentioned, we know was worthy of a party in Valhalla upon his arrival/death. Also mentioned in episode 1, through Harald's father's line, you can go up 27 generations to the Vanir god Freyr, who, according to the prologue of the Prosetta, is named Yngvi, the basis of the name Yngling. So Harald being a direct paternal descendant of this line would mean his royal house is the house of Yngling. Through his mother's line and ancestry to Odin, you can argue that anything from Volsung through Aslaug is from the house of Volsung. However, since Aslaug is female, when the line passes on to her children, the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, the house would change. For most of history, this is how it works with royal families. In this case, you could argue that they are among the house of Lodbrok, or maybe Ring, with Sigurd Ring being Ragnar's father. However, I think with Lodbrok meaning something like shaggy breeches, the pants he dipped into tar, then wore as he killed a dragon, that makes for a better house name in my opinion. So I like House of Lodbrok. Notes, the name of the house really doesn't matter, but I think at the end of this episode, it would be fun to list the houses that Odin is an ancestor of to truly show the, quote, legacy of the Allfather. Hey, that's the name of the episode. Now, Aslaug II, daughter of Sigurd Snake in the Eye, son of Ragnar Lothbrok, would also be a member of the House of Lothbrok, and I just realized I am saying Lodbrok or Lothbrok interchangeably, so I apologize. However, as the house passes through the male line, what about her son, Sigurd the Heart, who was his father? We'll need to go to Aslaug II's husband, a man named Helgi Havasi, who would be Sigurd the Heart's father. Helgi is a member of the House of Dagling, and he is the great-great-great-great-grandson of the namesake of that family, Dag. As it says in the Tale of Ragnar's Sons, when describing the death of Sigurd Snake in the Eye, son of Ragnar Lothbrok, it says, Sigurd Snake in the Eye and Bjorn Ironside in Fitzek raided widely in France. Then Bjorn headed back to his kingdom. After that, the Emperor Arnulf fought with the brothers, and 100,000 of Danes and Norwegians fell there. There also fell Sigurd Snake in Eye, and Gudrod was the name of another king who fell there. He was the son of Olaf, the son of Hring, the son of Ingald, the son of Ingi, the son of Hring, after whom Ringeric in Norway is known. Hring was the son of Dag, and Tor, mother of Drengs. Helgi Havasi the Sharp was the name of Gudrod's brother. So Sigurd the Heart, son of Helgi Havasi and Aslaug II, and his daughter Ragnhild would be from the house of Dagling. Ragnhild is wedded by Harald Fairhair's father, Halfdan the Black, from the house of Yngling, linking Odin's line through the Volsungs to the house of Yngling as well. So there is Odin's legacy in creating Norway. Let's go to the other two Scandinavian countries, Denmark and Sweden, starting with Denmark. Funny enough, this one also starts with Sigurd Snake in the Eye, son of Ragnar Lothbrok and Aslaug. Also note that I'll be leading into the historical kings of Denmark for right now, whereas I'll discuss another house that supposedly ruled Denmark for a time prior in a later episode on the house of Skjoldung that I mentioned earlier. Those would be legendary kings of Denmark, not historical. Anyway, going back to Sigurd Snake in the Eye, per the tale of Ragnar's sons, it says, Sigurd Snake in the Eye married Blasia, the daughter of King Ela. Her son was Knut, who was called Horda Knut, who succeeded his father in Zealand, Scania, and Halland. But Oslo Fjord broke away from his rule. Gorm was his son. So we have Gorm, the son of Harthacnut, the son of Sigurd, Snake in the Eye, the son of Ragnar and Aslaug. Now, King Ela is a king of Northumbria in the north of England, the same King Ela who killed Sigurd's father, Ragnar Lothbrok, by throwing him into a pit of poisonous snakes. So after the sons of Ragnar get revenge on King Ela, one of his sons, Sigurd, marries Ela's daughter. So Sigurd and this English princess, Blasia, had a son called Harthacnut, who had a son named Gorm, who is now known as Gorm the Old, the first king of Denmark. I also want to make a note here that Odin is also the ancestor of every founder of every Anglo-Saxon kingdom, Northumbria included, which we are going to discuss in the next episode in more detail. Now, King Ela, however, was not a member of Northumbria's founding house, and thus not a descendant of Odin. But anyway, going back to Gorm, in the same tale of Ragnar's sons, it says, Gorm took the kingship after his father. He married Tiri, who was called Denmark's savior, daughter of Clack Harald, who was a king in Jutland. But when Harald died, Gorm took all of Harald's realm under his rule too. So part of Gorm's land expansion was inheriting the land of his father-in-law. Now, Gorm's wife, Tiri's father, Harald, had another daughter. Going back to Snorri's Heimskringla, it says, Ragnhild's mother was Torni, the daughter of King Harald of Jutland and sister of Tiri, Queen of Denmark, who had married Gorm the Old, the ruler of Denmark. So this Ragnhild we have discussed in love is the mother of Harald Fairhair, the first king of Norway. Her father is Sigurd the Hart, the son of the second Aslaug, and her mother is Torni, daughter of Harald, who is also the father of Tiri, the wife of Gorm of Denmark. So not only do we now have a link where Sigurd's snake in the eye is a paternal ancestor of both first historical kings of Norway and Denmark, Harald Fairhair and Gorm the Old, we have another link to both kingdoms with Harald, petty king of Jutlands, who is also the ancestor of the kings of both kingdoms, Denmark and Norway. Now, if you look at a map of modern-day Denmark, Jutland is the land in Denmark that connects to mainland Europe, kind of sprouting out of it like an appendix. As far as Harald's house, I guess I could label his royal house as the House of Clack, or maybe the House of Jutland. Let's go with Jutland. Fun connection there, but you can see that even in the sort of pre or pseudo-historical world, marriages between royal families were quite evident. This seems to potentially continue because one source, the Historia Norwegiae, I definitely said that incorrectly, claims that Gorm's daughter Gunhild marries Harald Fairhair's son Erik Bloodaxe, who I mentioned earlier was set to go to Valhalla on his death in the poem Eriksmal. Now, going to Sweden and another son of Ragnar and Aslaug, Bjorn Ironside, both Heimskringla and the Saga of Hervor and Hedrick, to name a couple, show Bjorn as being the ancestor of the historical kings of Sweden. As we discussed in episode 1, Harald of Norway's line began in Uppsala in Sweden with the Vanir gods Freyr and Njord. So we have discussed the legendary petty kingdoms in Sweden in detail already. However, now going into the historical territory of this timeline. To get started, I'm going to go to chapter 15 of the Saga of Hervor and Hedrick. I want to make a note here that if I quote the Saga of the Volsungs, the Saga of Ragnar Lodbrok, or this saga, Hervor and Hedrick, you can assume it's Crawford's translation, along with the poetic Edda poems I quote as well. Anyway, the text says, After the death of King Ragnar, his son Bjorn Ironside took over the rule of Sweden, and Sigurd the Danish kingdom, and Fitzurk the East, but he doesn't matter in this episode of Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. And Ivar the Boneless took England. That last part is complicated and not historical, but that's going to be for another episode as well. The sons of Bjorn Ironside were Erik and Rafael, and King Erik ruled Sweden after his father. The sons of Erik, son of Bjorn Ironside, were Onund from Uppsala and King Bjorn. Erik was the son of King Onund, who took over the kingdom after his father. He was a mighty king. Before I continue, this King Erik, the second one, and at this point the great-great-grandson of Bjorn Ironside, and I want to make a note here that there are a lot of King Eriks in this line, just like there was a lot of Sigurds in Harald's line. However, this Erik is a rival of King Harald Fairhair during his reign, as told in the Saga of Harald Fairhair, found in Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla. They essentially had some border disputes, but nothing much came from it, with both kings growing old and dying. Anyway, continuing this line per the Saga of Hervor and Hedrick, it says, Bjorn was a son of King Erik in Uppsala. He took over the reign of the kingdom after his father and ruled a long time. The sons of Bjorn were Erik the Victorious and Olaf. They took dominion of the kingdom after their father. Erik ruled Sweden until his death day. Their son was named Olaf, who was taken as king in Sweden after King Erik. He was called Olaf Tax King, and he was the first of the Swedish kings to accept Christianity, which is pretty much a meme of irony for the first Christian king taxing people. Heimskringla gives us some supporting information as well. Right after Harald Fairhair's rival Erik, again the second of three of them in Bjorn's line, dies, it says, After Erik, his son Bjorn was king in Sweden for 50 winters. He was the father of Erik the Victorious. So anyway, we have Bjorn Ironside, his son Erik, his son Onund, his son Erik, rival of Harald, his son Bjorn, his son Erik the Victorious, and his son Olaf the Tax King. Erik the Victorious is considered the first historical king of Sweden, and not unlike Harald of Norway and Gorm of Denmark, a descendant of Ragnar and Aslaug. Also, the three first kings of Scandinavia have something else in common. Their sons, as heads of states of their respected countries, converted their countries to Christianity. You have Håkon the Good of Norway, Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, and Olaf the Tax King of Sweden. Also, today in the year 2025, these kingdoms still exist, with Harald V of Norway, Frederick X of Denmark, and Karl XVI Gustav of Sweden. Now, to put years on the reigns of these figures, according to Heimskringla, Harald Fairhair inherited his father's lands upon his death at the age of 10 in 860 CE, became the first king of a unified Norway at 22 in 872 CE. Then he reigned until 930 CE, when he abdicated the throne to his son Erik Bloodaxe. Then he died 3 years later in 933 CE at the age of 83. Gorm the Old of Denmark likely began his reign around 936 CE, ruling until his death sometime in the late 950s. Erik the Victorious, considered the first king of a historical Sweden, ruled from 970 CE until around 995 CE. His son Olaf reigned after him. Note that since there are more family members between Bjorn Ironside and Erik the Victorious, him reigning after Harald and Gorm makes sense, whereas the rest of this timeline really does not. Keep in mind, Gorm is supposedly the grandson of Sigurd Snake in the Eye, whereas Harald is his great-great-grandson. So Harald supposedly began his reign in Norway in 872 CE, 64 years before Gorm's reign supposedly began in Denmark. And per Heimskringla, a certain person we mentioned in the first episode of this podcast, Gyda, the woman who challenged Harald with conquering Norway in the first place, had this to say to Harald before he took the throne. So this would be before the year 872. Harald sends his men to woo, and yes, I'm putting that into quotes, Gyda on his behalf. She claps back with this gem. I won't waste my maidenhood in such a manner, to take for a husband a king who had not a bigger kingdom to rule than some shires like some damn hobbit. And to me it seems strange that there is no king who will possess himself all of Norway, so that he alone has rule over it, as King Gorm has in Denmark, or Erik in Uppsala. So Erik in Uppsala in Sweden could have been the Erik who rivaled Harald in the first place, the second one, or his grandfather Erik, son of Bjorn Ironside, who would be the first Erik. It certainly would not make sense if it was Erik the Victorious who she was referring to, because he would not begin his rule until over a century later after this. However, she clearly mentions Gorm of Denmark. And the dude supposedly didn't rule Denmark until 936. Again, 64 years after Harald had initially began ruling Norway, and probably wasn't even born at this time, to be honest. Maybe Gyda has some divine foresight, which is not out of the realm of possibility in this world, as we have seen, since others in Heimskringla had prophecies of the rise and greatness of Harald in his bloodline as well. However, even if it was the case that Gyda had divine foresight, when she told Harald's men about Gorm the Old of Denmark, they should have said, who the fuck is Gorm? However, with Erik the Victorious, it also sort of doesn't make sense according to Heimskringla, because it states that Harald's rival Erik, grandfather of Erik the Victorious, died after Harald had reigned Norway for 10 years, so this would be in 882 CE. It then states that Erik's son Bjorn ruled Sweden for 50 years, as I quoted earlier. Then Erik the Victorious took the throne upon his death. So 882 plus 50 is 932 CE. However, Erik the Victorious supposedly didn't start ruling Sweden until 970. So there's 38 years missing there. Also, I feel compelled to say something else, especially since in the next episode we'll be heading over the North Sea into England. The historical and documented Great Heathen Army, an army of Vikings who toppled most of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms beginning in the 860s. Per the saga of Ragnar Lodbrok, and this part is not historical, this invasion was led by the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, as mentioned earlier in an act of revenge against the Northumbrian king Aella. One of the sons of Ragnar leading the invasion was Sigurd Snake in the Eye. And again, this is the great-great-grandfather of Harald Fairhair. So Harald Fairhair, born in 850 CE, could not be the great-great-grandson of Sigurd Snake in the Eye, who led an invasion that began 15 years later. I mean, I guess technically he could, if as a descendant of Odin, Sigurd has an unnaturally long life. And I guess maybe in a later episode of the series, we will compare Odin's own descendancy from characters that link up to the Old Testament and the Bible, where people may live up to 900 years old. So I guess just to go with the theme of this podcast, we may as well pretend that this works. So keep in mind, all of this is very fuzzy and clearly an effort by me in this podcast to unsuccessfully force connections between gods and kings. And since the sagas and Eddas were written centuries after the events they are depicting, you need to understand that for the sake of storytelling, the authors bent the truth with both the timelines and the great deeds of their heroes, often linking them to deities like Snorri does. It's like if somebody today wrote a fan fiction epic where George Washington and Abraham Lincoln had a divine division together during the American Revolution, which, for obvious reasons, already does not work. And unfortunately, I'll have to rely on the United States education system to explain why that's obvious. But anyway, let's say hypothetically there's a story about these two presidents receiving a message from the Abrahamic God Yahweh, foretelling the rise of a modern political leader who is chosen by God who would save the world on America's 250th birthday. And somebody makes a podcast about it and claims that it's the truth, and people actually believe it, which based on modern social media trends is mortifyingly plausible. But anyway, just imagine if somebody did that to prop up the history of the United States, generating pride in one's country with the father of that country. This is not unlike Sax Grammaticus with Augusta de Norm or Snorri with Heimskringla, telling the stories about their countries to generate pride while also stretching the truth of their creations. So enough of that rabbit hole. To sum it up, going back to Ragnar and Aslaug, they left quite the legacy, which makes sense that through Aslaug, Odin's work on Midgard has left a lasting impression. What I'm about to say will be for another episode, but the ancestors of Ragnar have a history that deserves a lot of unpacking as well, not just through the Yinglings in Harald or the Volsungs, but for example in the saga of Hervor and Haedric, the main character, Haedric Wolfskin, is 7 generations above Ragnar. And the characters within those 7 generations also show a huge potential rivalry with the legendary kingdoms of Denmark and Sweden as well. So we'll certainly go further into these figures in later episodes. Figures like Ivar the Wide Conqueror, Harold Wartooth, not to be confused with Harold Bluetooth, son of Gorm the Old, and Sigurd Ring, Ragnar's father. So anyway, my voice hurts, but the show must go on. But not today, because that is the end of what was supposed to be part 2, the final part of the series, but is now part 2 of a 4 or 5 episode series. To recap, per this episode, we have covered the House of Volsung, the House of Lodbrok, the House of Dagling, the House of Jutland, and the House of Yngling as having divine ancestry from the Allfather himself. So he is building up quite the legacy. Next episode, I'll move on to the Anglo-Saxons. Their kings are supposedly descendant of Odin, or in their case, Woden as well. As in Dark Age history, there was a lot going on with the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings and their invasions of England. And as this podcast goes into the links between gods and kings, I'm going to need to give some historical context on top of what we discussed about their links to mythology. And in hindsight, I should have known that the Anglo-Saxons deserve their own episode in this series. And there's also going to be many, many more of them as this podcast continues, as England plays a very relevant role, not in just Dark Age history, but also heavily in the Norse sagas. Until then, I'll keep trying to grow a beard, and if I still cannot, may the gods have mercy on my soul. And until then, as well, let's hope your dogs keep barking at the mailman, because if not, it may be Odin looking to set up a regime change in your house. Anyway, have a great day, everyone. We'll see you next time.